Some wounds never heal, and some brothers never come home. For 40 years, Jedediah Mercer had wandered the mountains carrying both truths like stones in his chest. When a cold autumn night drove him to seek shelter in an abandoned church, Jed figured he'd found just another place to rest his weary bones. His faithful dog, Boone, settled beside him as they bedded down beneath broken rafters. But when midnight came, ancient bells began to toll from towers that hadn't rung in decades. What Jed discovered beneath the altar changed everything. A hidden cellar held his missing brother's journal and a secret that had been buried for 40 winters. His brother, the preacher who vanished without a trace, had been protecting something powerful. What could be so important that it would finally offer peace to a man who'd given up on forgiveness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had teeth that October evening, cutting through the pine needles with a sharpness that reminded Jed of things he'd rather forget. He pulled his worn coat tighter around his shoulders and adjusted the straps of his battered rucksack. Every step up the mountain trail sent a familiar ache through his right knee, a souvenir from a logging accident 20 years past that had ended his last attempt at steady work. Boone padded alongside him, the old dog's breath visible in small puffs of steam. The mutt had appeared on Jed's doorstep 7 winters ago, half-starved and bearing scars that spoke of hard living. Neither had asked questions of the other. Some partnerships were built on understanding rather than words, and theirs had endured. Through seasons that would have broken lesser bonds, the church emerged from the forest like a memory half-remembered. Its whitewashed walls had surrendered to weather and time, now wearing a coat of grey weathering and green moss. The bell tower leaned slightly to the east, as if the building itself was listening for something in the distance. Ivy claimed the foundation stones, and several windows stood empty of glass, their frames dark as vacant eyes. Jed had heard talk of this place in the valley below. Folks said it had been built by a circuit preacher back in the 1880s, meant to serve the scattered. Mining camps and logging operations that had sprouted like mushrooms after a rain. But the mines played out, the timber crews moved on, and the church was left to the mountain's keeping. Some claimed the preacher had simply walked away one winter morning, leaving his Bible open on the pulpit and his coffee still warm on the altar. Others whispered darker theories about men who disappeared in these mountains. But Jed had little patience for ghost stories. "Reckon this'll do for the night, old boy," Jed murmured to Boone, who had already begun investigating the church's perimeter with the thoroughness of a practiced scout. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges, creating a gap just wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Inside, the smell of old wood and forgotten prayers lingered in the air. Dust motes danced in the last rays of sunlight that filtered through the broken windows. Pews stood in crooked rows, some missing boards, others tilted at angles that suggested. The floor beneath had begun to settle unevenly. Jed set down his pack near the back wall and pulled out his bedroll. The ritual of making camp had become as natural as breathing over the decades of wandering. He'd learned long ago that comfort was a luxury, but preparation was survival. From his pack came a small camp stove, a dented pot, and the makings of a simple meal. Boone settled nearby, content to watch his master's familiar routine. As Jed worked, his eyes were drawn repeatedly to the altar at the front of the church. A simple wooden cross stood tilted against the back wall, and beneath it sat a small table that might once have held a Bible or communion elements. But it was the craftsmanship that caught his attention, the careful joinery, the smooth finish, despite years of neglect. Someone had built this place with love and intention. The thought brought Samuel to mind, as it so often did in quiet moments. His younger brother had possessed gifted hands when it came to woodworking, able to coax beauty from the roughest timber. Even as boys, Samuel could fashion toys and trinkets that seemed to hold magic in their grain. Their father had been a practical man who valued utility over artistry, But their mother had encouraged Samuel's creativity, setting aside scraps of good wood and keeping his tools sharp and oiled. "You've got the gift," she'd tell Samuel while watching him work. "The Lord gave you hands that can bring joy to others. Don't ever forget that." Samuel had been 17 when he announced his calling to become a preacher. The family had gathered around the kitchen table that evening in 1878, the oil lamp casting dancing shadows on their faces as Samuel spoke with the quiet conviction that would define his life. "I've been praying on it for months," Samuel had said, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of his declaration. "The Lord has work for me to do, and I can't ignore his calling any longer." Their father had been skeptical. "Preaching's a hard life, son. Lots of travel, little pay, and people don't always want to hear what you have to say." "I know, Pa, but I can't shake the feeling that there are folks out there who need to hear that they're not forgotten, that there's hope even in the darkest places." Jed had been 22 then, already working the logging camps and saving money for land of his own. He'd supported his brother's decision, even admired it. Samuel had always been the thoughtful, the brother who read by candlelight and asked questions that made their father uncomfortable. If anyone was meant for the ministry, it was Samuel. The falling out had come 2 years later, over a woman named Catherine Mills. She'd been new to their valley, a schoolteacher from back east with honey-colored hair and a laugh that could brighten the darkest winter day. Both brothers had courted her, but Samuel's gentle nature and educated conversation had won her heart. They'd been engaged to marry in the spring of 1881. Jed had told himself he was happy for them. He'd even helped Samuel build the little house where they planned to start their life together. But jealousy was a poison that worked slowly, and by winter it had consumed whatever brotherly love remained. The argument that ended their relationship had been ugly. Words spoken in anger that could never be taken back, accusations that cut deeper than any physical blow. "You always thought you were better than me," Jed had shouted that night, "with your books and your prayers and your high-minded talk. But you're just like everyone else. You take what you want and dress it up in pretty words." Samuel had stood there in the snow outside the church where he'd been preparing for Christmas services, his face pale with hurt and bewilderment. "Jed, I never—" "Don't. Just don't. You want her, you got her. But don't expect me to stand there and smile while you play the saint." Those had been the last words Jed spoke to his brother. Samuel had married Catherine the following spring, and by summer he'd accepted a position as a circuit preacher, riding from town to town throughout Colorado and New Mexico. Jed had received word of their departure through their mother, along with a letter from Samuel that he'd never opened. Pride was a stubborn beast, and 40 years hadn't been enough to tame it completely. The last anyone had heard from Samuel was a letter to their parents in the winter of 1883, postmarked from Santa Fe. He'd written about his work among the mining camps, the challenges of bringing faith to rough men in rougher places, and his growing concern about certain difficulties he'd encountered. The letter had been optimistic despite its cryptic warnings, full of Samuel's characteristic determination to find good in any situation. Then, nothing. No more letters, no word from fellow preachers, no trace of Samuel or Catherine. They'd simply vanished into the vast wilderness of the Southwest, leaving behind only questions and the ache of unfinished business. Their parents had died within a year of each other, taking with them any hope of reconciliation. Jed had inherited the family land, sold it within a month, and taken to the mountains with the restlessness of a man running from his own conscience. 40 years of wandering had followed, logging camps, mining operations, hunting guides, any work that kept him moving and his hands busy. Now, sitting in this forgotten church as darkness gathered outside, Jed felt the weight of those lost decades, pressing down like a physical thing. Boone sensed his master's mood and moved closer, resting his grizzled head on Jed's knee. The simple gesture of comfort from his faithful companion brought unexpected moisture to the old man's eyes. "We're a pair of old fools, ain't we, boy?" Jed whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears, "carrying around hurts that should have been buried long ago." Outside, the wind picked up, sending a loose shutter somewhere banging against the church's weathered siding. The sound echoed through the empty building like an irregular heartbeat. Jed finished his meager supper and banked his small fire, preparing for what he hoped would be a peaceful night's rest. But as he settled into his bedroll and Boone curled up beside him, neither man nor dog could shake the feeling that they were not alone in this place. Something lingered in the shadows between the pews, something that remembered when this church had been filled with voices raised in song and hearts lifted in prayer. Whether it was memory or something more substantial remained to be seen. The last thing Jed remembered before sleep took him was the sound of the wind through the broken windows, carrying with it what might have been the echo of distant bells, or perhaps just the whisper of old regrets finally coming home to roost. The bells began at midnight. Jed, quote, as eyes snapped open in the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs as the deep bronze tones rolled through the mountain air. Beside him, Boone had risen to a crouch, his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in his throat. The dog's eyes reflected what little moonlight filtered through the broken windows, fixed on something Jed couldn't see. "Easy, boy," Jed whispered, though his own voice carried a tremor he couldn't quite suppress. The bells tolled 3 times, then fell silent. In the aftermath, the church seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Jed lay still for several minutes, listening to the wind and his own pulse, before convincing himself it had been a dream. Old buildings made strange sounds in the night, settling timbers, loose metal caught by the wind. Nothing more than that. But when he closed his eyes, the bells rang again. This time, Jed sat up fully, reaching for the small flashlight in his pack. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar interior of the church, exactly as he'd left it. Empty pews, tilted cross, dust motes dancing in the light. Yet something felt different, as if the very air had shifted while he slept. Boone whined softly and padded toward the front of the church. The dog moved with purpose, nose to the ground, following a scent trail only he could detect. Jed followed, his bare feet silent on the worn wooden floor. At the altar, Boone stopped and began pawing at the base of the simple table. His claws scraped against wood that sounded hollow, different from the solid planks elsewhere. Jed knelt and ran his hands over the altar's base, feeling along the edges until his fingers found what Boone had detected, a seam in the wood, nearly invisible, but definitely present. "What have you found, old boy?" The seam outlined a panel roughly 2 feet square. When Jed pressed against it, the wood gave slightly, as if held in place by something more than tight joinery. He worked his fingernails into the gap and pulled. The panel came away with surprising ease, revealing a dark space beneath the altar. Jed quotes flashlight beam revealed stone steps descending into what appeared to be a small cellar carved from the mountain rock itself. The air that rose from below and carried scents of age and secrets, old paper, candle wax, and something else he couldn't identify. Boone whined again, but made no move to descend. "I hear you, boy, but we've come this far." The steps were solid despite their age, clearly cut by someone who knew stonework. Jed descended carefully, one hand on the rough-hewn wall for balance. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, perhaps 8 feet square and tall enough for a man to stand upright. His light revealed shelves cut into the rock walls and a simple wooden table in the center. On the table lay an oil lamp and a leather-bound journal, both covered in dust, but remarkably well preserved. Jed's hands shook slightly as he lit the lamp with matches from his pocket. The warm glow revealed more details. Additional books on the shelves, rolled papers that might be maps, and in one corner what appeared to be a wooden crate, reinforced with iron bands. But it was the journal that commanded his attention. The leather cover bore the initials SM, burned into the hide with a hot iron. Samuel Mercer. Jed's throat tightened as he opened to the first page and saw his brother's familiar handwriting, as neat and careful as it had been 40 years ago. November 15th, 1883. I pray this record finds its way to someone who can understand what I've discovered and why I must act as I have. The burden I carry grows heavier with each passing day, but I cannot, will not, abandon the trust placed in me. I arrived in this valley 3 days ago, following the map Father Martinez provided in Santa Fe. The church stands as he described, abandoned but sound, perfect for what must be done. The local miners speak of strange lights in these mountains, of sounds that have no earthly source. They do not know how close to the truth they speak. Jed, quote, S. hands trembled as he turned the page. Samuel's voice seemed to speak from the yellowed paper, as clear as if he stood in the cellar beside him. The artifacts are safely hidden now, though I know our pursuers are close. 3 men on horseback passed through the valley yesterday, asking in questions about a traveling preacher. They described me well enough that I knew my time here grows short, but the covenant must be honored, regardless of personal cost. If something happens to me, let it be known that I acted not from greed, but from duty. The treasures I guard were never meant for Spanish gold or American dollars. They belong to God and His people, and I will see them protected even unto death. The entries continued for several pages, growing more cryptic and urgent with each date. Samuel wrote of Los Custodios, the guardians, a secret order within, the Catholic Church dedicated to protecting sacred artifacts from those who would use them for earthly gain. He'd been recruited during his travels through New Mexico, his reputation for honesty and his skills with languages making him valuable to their cause. November 20th, 1883. They found me. 3 men rode up to the church at dawn, armed and ready. For trouble. Their leader, a man named Briggs, spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through force. They know about the artifacts, though not their exact nature or location. I told them nothing, but I fear my silence only convinced them I have something worth hiding. Briggs gave me until tomorrow to reconsider my position. I know what that means. I've prepared for this possibility, hidden what must be hidden, and said my prayers. If I do not survive the night, may God forgive me for the pain this will cause those I love, especially Jed. I pray he will understand someday that some duties transcend family bonds. Jed, quote, S. vision blurred as he read the final entries. His brother had known death was coming and had faced it with the same quiet courage that had defined his life. The last entry was dated November 21st, written in a hand that shook with either fear or cold. They have returned. I hear their horses. Outside, the artifacts are secure. They will never find what they seek, not in 1,000 years. I go now to meet whatever fate awaits, knowing I have done my duty to God and conscience. May those who come after me prove wiser than those who came before. To my brother Jed, should this ever reach him, I forgive you for the words spoken in anger. Love was never something to fight over, and I pray you have found peace in these years we've been apart. The key to the great secret lies where only family would think to look. Trust in Boone's nose. He knows more than he appears. The journal ended there, but several loose pages had been tucked between the back cover and binding. Jed's flashlight revealed maps of the surrounding mountains, sketches of what appeared to be Aztec or Spanish symbols, and a detailed drawing of an ornate golden chalice inlaid with precious stones. At the bottom of the last page, in Samuel's careful script, were the words, "The cup of sorrows belongs to no earthly king." Boone's sudden bark from above broke Jed's concentration. The dog had remained at the entrance to the cellar, but now his warning carried an urgency that spoke of immediate danger. Jed quickly closed the journal and climbed back to the main church, leaving the lamp burning below. In the corner where he'd left his bedroll, Boone stood rigid, his attention focused on something near the altar's base. Jed's flashlight beam revealed What had captured the dog's attention? A pile of bones, yellowed with age but clearly human. A skull grinned up at him from empty sockets, and scattered around it were the remains of what had once been a man. But these weren't Samuel's bones. Even after 40 years, Jed would have recognized his brother's build, his height. These remains belonged to someone smaller, slighter, and clutched in the skeleton's bony fingers was a leather pouch that clinked softly when Jed lifted it. Inside the pouch were gold coins, Spanish pieces of 8 that gleamed despite their age. 30 pieces exactly, Jed counted with growing unease. Payment for a betrayal, perhaps, or wages for work left unfinished. The implications struck him like a physical blow. Someone had died in this church, someone who'd been carrying Spanish gold. The bones showed no obvious signs of violence, but death in the wilderness could come from many causes. Exposure, disease, accident, or murder. Samuel*S journal had mentioned. 3 men pursuing him. Had one of them died here, or had there been others involved in this deadly game of hunt and hunted? Boone whined softly and nudged Jed's leg, drawing his attention back to the present. The dog's eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved his master, as if the animal understood far more than he could communicate. Now that intelligence seemed focused on the bones, the journal, and the growing certainty that they were not alone in this place. "What is it, boy? What do you know that I don't?" As if in answer to his question, a sound echoed from somewhere deep. In the mountain, not quite footsteps, not quite voices, but something that spoke of movement in places where nothing should move. The hair on Jed's neck stood up as he realized that Samuel's story was far from over. His brother had died protecting something valuable enough to kill for, something hidden in these mountains for 40 years. The journal spoke of artifacts and sacred treasures, of men who would stop at nothing to claim them. And now Jed found himself holding the key to secrets that had already cost lives. The bells in the tower were silent now, but their midnight message had been delivered. Some truths refused to stay buried, no matter how deep the grave or how long the years. Samuel's voice spoke from beyond death itself, calling his brother to finish what had been started in blood and betrayal. Jed looked down at the journal in his hands, then at the bones scattered around the altar. Whatever his brother had hidden in these mountains was still here, still waiting, and somewhere in the darkness beyond these walls, others might still be searching for what Samuel had died to protect. "Looks like we're not done yet, old boy," Jed whispered to Boone, who thumped his tail once in what might have been agreement or warning. The night was far from over, and the real mystery was just beginning. Dawn came grey and cold, filtering through the broken windows like reluctant hope. Jed had not slept after discovering the bones. Instead, he'd spent the remaining hours of darkness studying Samuel's journal by lamplight, tracing his brother's final days through careful entries that revealed both courage and growing desperation. The morning light showed details he'd missed in the shadows. The skeleton wore the remnants of clothing that might once have been fine, scraps of wool and leather that spoke of quality, not the rough garb of a common drifter. More importantly, the bones lay in an unnatural position, as if the man had crawled to this spot before dying. "He was trying to reach the cellar," Jed murmured to Boone, who sat nearby watching with intelligent eyes. Whatever killed him, he thought safety lay below. But safety had proven elusive for everyone who'd entered this church seeking sanctuary. Samuel's journal painted a picture of hunted men and deadly secrets, of artifacts worth killing for and faith worth dying to protect. The Spanish coins suggested greed as a motive, but the careful way Samuel wrote about his sacred trust indicated something deeper than mere treasure. Jed returned to the cellar, this time bringing a kerosene lantern from his pack to provide better light. The additional illumination revealed details that had escaped him in the darkness. The carved shelves held not just books and papers, but also small objects wrapped in oiled cloth. Religious medals, carved figurines, items that seemed more precious. for their spiritual significance than material value. The wooden crate in the corner bore Spanish markings burned into its sides. Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, 1882. The iron reinforcements had been added later, presumably by Samuel, along with a heavy lock that still held after 4 decades. Whatever lay inside had been deemed valuable enough to secure with extra care. Samuel.'s journal provided some clues. The entry dated November 18th mentioned the cup and its companions safely stored, while another reference spoke of 12 pieces of the greater treasure, each blessed by hands now dust. But the most intriguing passage came from November 19th. I have hidden the great secret where only family would think to look, in the place our mother taught us to seek comfort in times of trouble. The cup rests with the word, protected by the covenant of blood and faith. Jed read the passage 3 times before understanding struck him. Their mother had indeed taught them to find comfort somewhere specific, in the family Bible between the pages where she'd pressed flowers from their grandmother's garden. It was a tradition passed down through generations of Mercer women, a way of preserving beauty and memory together. But Samuel couldn't mean their mother's Bible. That had been buried with her, along with its pressed flowers and handwritten notes. Unless Jed's eyes went to the bookshelf, where several leather-bound volumes sat waiting. He'd assumed they were religious texts, common enough in any preacher's collection. But as he lifted them one by one, his heart began to race. The 3rd volume bore no title on its spine, but when he opened it, familiar handwriting appeared on the inside cover. Property of Mercy Abernathy Mercer, given to her beloved son Samuel on his ordination day, 1880. May this word guide your path as it has guided mine. It was their mother's handwriting, though the Bible was not the one from home. This was a traveling Bible, meant for circuit riding and rough conditions. But the tradition remained. Between the pages of Psalms, dried flowers were pressed flat. Their colors faded, but their shapes still recognizable. Larkspur, columbine, Indian paintbrush, wildflowers from the Colorado mountains their mother had loved. Jed, quote, S. hands shook as he turned the pages, searching for whatever Samuel had hidden. With the word, near the back of the book, tucked between the final pages of Revelation and the rear binding, his fingers encountered something that didn't belong. A folded piece of oiled leather, thin as parchment, but tough as iron. Inside the leather was a wooden cross, no larger than a man's thumb, but carved with exquisite detail. The wood was dark with age, possibly cedar, and bore initials that made Jed's breath catch. SM, carved in flowing script, along with symbols he didn't recognize, spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift in the lamplight. But it was what accompanied the cross that truly stunned him. Wrapped separately in silk cloth was a small brass key, ornate and obviously old, bearing the same Spanish markings he'd seen on the wooden crate. Samuel had left him the means to open whatever treasure he'd died protecting. Yet even as Jed held the key, doubt gnawed at him. Why had Samuel hidden these things here in a place Jed might never find? The journal's reference to family looking suggested his brother had expected or hoped that Jed would eventually seek him out, but 40 years had passed without contact. What kind of faith had sustained Samuel's belief that reconciliation would come? He knew me better than I knew myself, Jed realized. Knew that pride wouldn't keep me away forever, that eventually the loneliness would drive me to seek answers. The carved cross felt warm in his palm, as if it held some trace of his brother's touch. The symbols carved into its surface seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen them. Spanish colonial churches used similar motifs, and their father had once worked construction on a mission renovation in Santa Fe. Perhaps these patterns held significance beyond mere decoration. Boone, quote, S. Sudden alertness interrupted his contemplation. The dog had been lying quietly at the top of the cellar stairs, but now he stood rigid, ears pricked toward the church's entrance. His low growl carried a warning that raised the hair on Jed's arms. "What is it, boy?" The answer came in the form of hoofbeats, distant but approaching, the steady rhythm of horses picking their way up the mountain trail. Jed quickly extinguished his lantern and climbed back to the main church, the carved cross and key clutched in his fist. Through a gap in the broken windows, he could see riders emerging from the tree line below. 3 men on horseback, moving, with the purposeful manner of those who knew exactly where they were headed. Even at distance, something about their approach suggested they were not casual travelers seeking shelter. Jed gathered his belongings quickly but quietly, stuffing the journal and cross into his pack along with his few possessions. The Spanish coins from the skeleton went into his pocket, evidence that might prove useful later. But the brass key he kept separate, tucked into the secret compartment of his worn belt where he'd carried emergency money for decades. Boone waited by the rear door, already understanding they needed to leave without being seen. The old dog had learned to read danger in all its forms during their years together. His instincts had kept them both alive more than once, and Jed trusted them implicitly. They slipped out through the back of the church, just as the riders crested the final rise. From the shelter of the surrounding pines, Jed got his first clear look at the men who'd come calling. They were well-dressed for mountain travel, their horses too fine for common drifters. The leader sat his saddle with military bearing, scanning the church and surrounding area with experienced eyes. "Looks like we found it, boys," the man called to his companions, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Just like the old man said it would be." Jed's blood chilled. These weren't random visitors. They'd been directed here by someone who knew about the church, about Samuel's connection to it. But who could possess such knowledge after 40 years? And what? Old man could have provided directions to a secret Samuel had died to protect. The riders dismounted and approached the church with weapons drawn. Professional caution, not the nervous fear of men entering unknown territory. They'd done this before, searched for things others had hidden, taken what they pleased from those. Too weak to resist from his concealment, Jed watched them enter the church. Their voices carried through the broken walls as they discovered the open panel beneath the altar, the bones scattered around it, the evidence of recent habitation. Anger colored their words when they realized the cellar had been disturbed, that someone had been there before them. 40 years we've been looking, one of them snarled. 40 damn years, and now some saddle tramp stumbles onto it first. Maybe not, the leader replied, his voice calm and thoughtful. These tracks are fresh, no more than hours old. Our friend can't have gotten far, especially if he's carrying what we came for. Jed's heart hammered as he realized they meant to follow his trail. Boone sensed his master's fear and pressed closer, offering what comfort he could. But they both knew running wouldn't be enough. These men had resources, determination, and 4 decades of searching behind them. They wouldn't give up easily. The carved cross seemed to burn against Jed's palm where he clutched it. Samuel had died rather than reveal its secrets, had trusted that someday family would come to finish what he'd started. Now that burden fell to an old mountain man who'd spent 40 years running from responsibility, guided only by a faithful dog, and the memory of a brother he'd failed to forgive. But as he watched the riders spread out to search for his trail, Jed felt something shift inside him. The loneliness and regret that had defined his wandering years began to crystallize into something harder, more purposeful. Samuel had believed in something worth dying for. Perhaps it was time to discover if it was also worth living for. "Come on, old boy," he whispered to Boone. "Time to learn what our Samuel was really protecting." They melted deeper into the forest, leaving no trail the hunters could follow. But Jed carried with him the weight of sacred trust and the growing certainty that some secrets were too important to remain buried forever. 3 miles up the ridge, Jed found what he was looking for. A hunter's shelter he'd used years before, little more than a lean-to built against a massive boulder, but hidden from casual view by a screen of aspen and pine. The structure had weathered well, its roof still sound enough to keep out the worst of mountain weather. Boone settled immediately, his tongue lolling as he panted from the hard climb. They'd covered the distance in less than an hour, moving fast. Enough to outdistance pursuit, but carefully enough to leave minimal trail. Jed's old skills from his logging days served him well, reading the land, finding the paths that left few tracks, using stone and fallen timber to mask their passage. But he knew the respite was temporary. The men below had the look of professionals, and professionals didn't give up easily. They'd find his trail eventually, follow it with the patience of hunters who'd already waited 40 years for their prize. While Boone rested, Jed examined the items he'd taken from the church with greater care. Samuel's journal deserved deeper study, its pages holding secrets that might mean the difference between life and death. But it was the other discovery, hidden in the journal's binding, that truly captured his attention. Tucked between the back cover and final page was a daguerreotype photograph, cracked with age, but still clear enough to make out details. It showed Samuel standing with 3 other men in front of what appeared to be a Spanish mission. All 4 wore the serious expressions common to early photography, but their clothing suggested this was no casual gathering. Samuel looked younger than Jed remembered, his face bearing the earnest intensity that had marked his calling to the ministry. Beside him stood a man in clerical robes, definitely a priest, though his features suggested Native American heritage rather than Spanish. The third figure wore the rough clothes of a frontiersman, but his bearing suggested education and authority. The fourth man was clearly Mexican, dressed in the fine clothing of wealth or position. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, Los Custodios, Santa Fe, 1882, F. Martinez, J. Whitehorse, C. Valdez, S. Mercer. May God preserve our sacred trust. Jed studied each face carefully, memorizing details that might prove important later. These were the men who'd recruited his brother into their secret order, who'd trusted him with whatever treasure now lay hidden in these mountains. If any of them still lived, they might hold answers to questions that Samuel's journal had raised but not resolved. The journal itself painted a picture of growing danger in those final weeks. Samuel's entries detailed his journey from Santa Fe to the abandoned church, carrying artifacts that Los Custodios had entrusted to his protection. But the nature of those artifacts remained frustratingly vague. References to the cup and its companions, blessed vessels of the ancient faith, and treasures that belonged to God alone. One entry stood out for its specificity. November 10th, 1883. Father Martinez spoke truly when he warned that possession of these holy objects would bring both blessing and curse. I feel their presence even through the blessed wrappings, a warmth that speaks of divine touch. The great cup pulses with its own life, as if the very blood of Christ still flows within its golden depths. But I understand now why men would kill for such things, not for their gold and jewels, but for the power they represent. Power to heal, to inspire, to transform the faithless into believers. I have seen what the cup can do when held by worthy hands, but in the wrong hands, such artifacts become tools of corruption, ways to claim divine authority for earthly ambitions. This is why they must remain hidden until the world proves worthy of their return. The implications staggered Jed. His brother hadn't died protecting mere treasure. He'd guarded what he believed to be actual relics of Christ's crucifixion. Whether such claims held truth mattered less than Samuel's absolute faith in their authenticity. He died a martyr's death for artifacts he considered sacred beyond price. But Samuel's journal held more immediate concerns. The entries describing his pursuers painted a disturbing picture of organized pursuit spanning years, not months. These weren't simple treasure hunters following a recent rumor. They were part of something larger, more persistent. November 18th, 1883 Briggs found me again today, though I was certain I'd lost his trail in the canyon country. He speaks of the consortium, men of wealth and influence who've been seeking these artifacts for decades. They know too much, details about the cup's history, its journey from the Holy Land to Spanish missions, the names of those who've guarded it through the centuries. Someone has betrayed Los Custodios from within. Briggs offered terms again. Gold enough to buy a ranch, protection for Catherine and myself, safe passage to California. All for the location of certain church property he claims belongs to his. Employers by right of purchase. But I've seen the hunger in his eyes, heard the way he speaks of the cup's powers. Such men would use sacred vessels for worldly gain, corrupting their purpose beyond redemption. Jed's hands tightened on the journal. Catherine, Samuel's wife, had been with him during those final weeks. The journal's references to her safety suggested she might have escaped whatever fate befell his brother, but 40 years without word could mean many things, most of them dark. Boone's low whine interrupted his thoughts. The dog had risen to his feet, ears pricked toward the valley. Below, in the distance, barely visible through the trees, smoke rose from the direction of the church. Their pursuers had made camp, settling in for what might be a long hunt. "Smart bastards," Jed muttered. "They know we can't have gotten far carrying whatever they think we took." But that assumption worked both ways. If the treasure hunters believed Jed had already found Samuel's artifacts, they'd focus their search on tracking him rather than examining the church more thoroughly. The wooden crate in the cellar might remain undiscovered, at least temporarily. Jed studied the brass key Samuel had hidden with the carved cross. Its weight felt substantial despite its size, and the Spanish markings suggested age and importance. But using it would require returning to the church, getting past 3 armed men who knew exactly what they were looking for. The carved cross itself raised more questions than answers. The symbols etched into its surface seemed familiar, yet frustratingly obscure. Geometric patterns that reminded him of Pueblo pottery, Spanish colonial architecture, even the stone carvings their father had pointed out during that long-ago trip to Santa Fe. Think calmer, old man, Jed told himself. Samuel didn't hide things randomly. Every choice had purpose. Every clue pointed somewhere specific. The reference to family-looking remained key. Their mother had taught them to seek comfort in specific ways. Pressed flowers in Bibles, certainly, but also other traditions. She'd insisted on family prayers at bedtime, Sunday readings from Scripture, and memories struck like lightning. Their mother's favorite psalm, the one she'd recited during thunderstorms when the boys were frightened, Psalm 23, with its promise of comfort in the valley of the shadow of death. But she'd always added her own ending, words passed down from her own mother. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, in the place he has prepared for those who trust in his providence." The place he has prepared, not just heaven, but somewhere specific, somewhere their mother believed God set aside for the faithful. She'd spoken of it as a real location, not merely a spiritual metaphor. Jed pulled out the journal and read Samuel's final entry again with new understanding. The key to the great secret lies where only family would think to look. Not just in the Bible with the pressed flowers, but in the place their mother had taught them to associate with ultimate safety and divine protection. The church itself was too obvious, too exposed to serve as a permanent hiding place. But their mother had spoken of other sacred spaces, places where the faithful gathered to worship away from the world's corruption. She'd mentioned Pueblo mission churches, hidden cliff dwellings where ancient peoples had built shrines, caves blessed by hermit priests seeking solitude with God. The carved symbols on the cross began to make sense, markers pointing toward such a place, combining Spanish colonial, Native American, and perhaps even older traditions. Samuel had found or created a sanctuary worthy of the artifacts he protected. somewhere that honored all the faiths that had touched these mountains over. The centuries, but finding it would require more than clever deduction. The journal's references to specific locations remained cryptic, protected by codes that assumed the reader shared Samuel's knowledge of local geography and religious history. Maps existed. Jed had seen them in the cellar. But retrieving them meant returning to the church where armed men waited. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Jed made his decision. Waiting accomplished nothing except giving his pursuers time to organize a more thorough search. Better to act while they assumed he was fleeing rather than planning a return. "What do you think, old boy?" he asked Boone. "Ready for another adventure?" The dog's tail wagged once, not enthusiasm, but acceptance. They'd been partners too long for either to harbor illusions about the danger ahead, but loyalty ran deeper than fear, and some trusts transcended common sense. Jed packed his few possessions carefully, leaving behind anything that might slow their movement or create noise. The journal and cross went into the most secure pocket of his coat, protected by oiled leather against moisture and impact. The brass key he wore on a cord around his neck, close to his heart, where his brother's trust deserved to rest. As twilight settled over the mountains, man and dog began their descent toward the church, where 3 hunters waited, with 40 years of patience finally nearing its end. But they carried with them more than desperate hope. They bore the accumulated wisdom of 2 brothers' love, tested by time and tempered by faith into something stronger than mere treasure hunting could understand. Samuel, S voice seemed to whisper. From the growing darkness, some duties transcend family bonds. But family bonds can transcend even death itself. The real hunt was about to begin. The church lay shrouded in darkness when Jed and Boone approached from the north, moving through timber that grew thick enough to muffle their footsteps. The treasure. Hunters had built their fire in the shelter of the building's east wall, its glow visible through the broken windows, like trapped lightning. Voices carried on the still air. 3 men discussing plans with the easy confidence of those who believed they held all the advantages. "Track leads up the ridge, clear as day," one was saying. "Old fool's probably holed up in some cave, thinking he can wait us out." "Don't underestimate him," replied the voice Jed recognized as the leader. 40 years in these mountains teaches a man things city folks never learn. He might be watching us right now." The third man laughed, but it held no humor. "Let him watch. Won't change what happens when we find him." Jed studied the church's perimeter from the concealment of a fallen pine. The hunters had posted no sentries, confident that their quarry was fleeing rather than approaching. Their horses stood hobbled near the fire, fine animals that spoke of resources and planning. These weren't desperate men making wild gambles. They represented organization, patience, and considerable investment. But their very competence created opportunities for someone who knew the building's layout. The rear entrance, where Jed had fled earlier, remained in shadow, hidden from their fire by the church's bulk. If he could reach it unseen, the cellar access would allow him to retrieve the maps and other materials Samuel had left behind. Boone sensed his master's intentions and moved closer, pressing against Jed's leg in silent communication. The dog's presence steadied him, reminding him that he wasn't facing this alone. They'd survived worse odds together, though admittedly never with so much at stake. Moving with the careful patience of a lifetime spent in wild places, Jed worked his way around to the church's blindside. Each step was placed with deliberate care, avoiding dry branches and loose stones that might betray his presence. Boone followed like his shadow, equally silent, equally focused. The rear door stood slightly ajar, just as he'd left it hours earlier. Jed paused to listen, hearing only the continued conversation from around front. The hunters were debating search patterns for tomorrow, confident they'd begin tracking at first light. Their arrogance would cost them, though they didn't know. Yet inside the church, familiar shadows welcomed him back. The cellar entrance remained open, Samuel's lamp still burning below with the steady flame of good oil and careful tending. Jed descended quickly, his earlier caution replaced by urgent need. Time was precious, and every moment spent here increased. The risk of discovery. The maps proved more detailed than he'd hoped. Samuel had been thorough in his documentation, creating hand-drawn charts that showed not just topography, but also historical sites, water sources, and what appeared to be Native American pictographs. One map in particular caught Jed's attention, a detailed rendering of a canyon system northwest of the church, marked with Spanish colonial symbols and annotated in Samuel's careful handwriting. Cañón de los Santos, Samuel had written at the top. Canyon of the Saints. Site of original mission established 1692, destroyed by Apache raids 1748. Natural caves blessed by Franciscan fathers for sacred purposes. Local tribes consider location sacred to their ancestors. Neutral ground where all faiths may seek the divine. The map showed a hidden approach through a slot canyon, marked with warnings about flash floods and unstable rock. But more importantly, it depicted a series of caves connected by narrow passages, with one chamber marked by the same geometric symbols that decorated the carved cross. Here, Samuel had written beside that chamber, where three traditions become one. Other maps showed the broader region, with routes marked to and from Santa Fe, Colorado mining camps, and various mission sites throughout the Southwest. Samuel had been creating an extensive network, documenting not just the immediate area, but the entire region where Los Custodios operated. The scope suggested an organization far larger than 4 men and a traveling preacher. Jed gathered the most crucial maps, rolling them carefully and securing them inside his coat. But it was the contents of the wooden crate that truly stunned him. Using Samuel's key, the lock opened with surprising ease despite its age. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and fine silk, lay artifacts that took his breath away. The cup itself was smaller than he'd expected, but magnificent in its craftsmanship. Gold inlaid with precious stones caught the lamplight and threw it back in patterns that seemed to move of their own accord. The workmanship was unlike anything Jed had seen. Not Spanish colonial, not Native American, but something older and more refined. Hebrew letters were inscribed around the rim, interwoven with symbols that might have been early Christian or possibly older still. But the cup was not alone. The crate held 11 other vessels, smaller cups, bowls, and ornate plates that matched the central chalice in style and apparent age. Each piece bore inscriptions in different languages, creating a collection that spoke of multiple cultures. And centuries of reverence. Samuel, S final letter tucked beneath the artifacts, explained their significance. My beloved brother, if you read this, then God has indeed guided your steps to complete what I began. These vessels are not mere treasures but sacred relics of our Lord's Last Supper, preserved through centuries of faith and sacrifice. The great cup was blessed by Christ himself, used to institute the holiest of sacraments. Its companions served the 12 apostles in that upper room where our salvation was sealed. Los Custodios has guarded these treasures since the Holy Land fell to Muslim conquest, carrying them first to Spain, then to the New World, where they might find sanctuary. But greed and corruption follow even sacred things, and evil men now seek to claim them for earthly power. I have failed in my duty to transport them to safety, but perhaps in failure I have served God's purpose. These mountains hold power older than Christianity, older than European conquest. The native peoples knew these canyons as sacred long before Spanish priests blessed them for our faith. Here, perhaps, ancient wisdom and new revelation confined. Harmony. The choice is yours now, Jed. Hide them forever, where none may claim their power for good or evil, or trust that somewhere in this world faithful hearts still exist who would use such blessings as God intended. I pray you choose more, wisely than I, and that forgiveness finds us both in whatever life awaits beyond this one. Jed. hands shook as he refolded the letter. Whether the artifacts were truly what Samuel believed them to be mattered less than the faith that had driven his brother to die protecting them. Men throughout history had killed and died for objects they considered sacred, creating holiness. Through belief as much as through divine touch. But the conversation from above suddenly changed tone, drawing his attention back to immediate danger. "Somebody's been back here," one of the hunters was saying. "These ashes are still warm, and there's fresh disturbance around the altar." Jed's blood went cold. They'd discovered his earlier presence, realized their quarry hadn't simply fled into the wilderness. Boots scraped overhead as they spread out to search the building more thoroughly. "Check everything," the leader ordered. "If there's a hiding place, we find it tonight." Time had run out. Jed quickly secured the artifacts in their protective wrappings and sealed the crate, but he left it in the cellar. The wait would slow. His escape and these treasures deserved better than to be lost in a desperate flight through mountain darkness. Samuel's maps would have to suffice. They contained the information needed to find the permanent sanctuary his brother had prepared. But even as he prepared to leave, footsteps approached the altar above. Someone was examining the hidden panel, probing its edges with the thoroughness of professional search. Discovery was moments away. Jed extinguished the lamp and felt his way to the cellar's far corner, where deeper shadows offered concealment. Boone pressed against his legs, sensing the danger that now filled the air like smoke. Above them, the panel creaked as someone pried it fully open. Well, the leader's voice drifted down. "Looks like our mountain man found something interesting." Light from their torches began to penetrate the cellar as they started down the stone steps. There was nowhere to run, no way to avoid discovery. Jed's hand went to the knife on his belt, not much against 3 armed men, but better than surrendering. Without a fight. Then Boone moved. The old dog slipped away from Jed's side and bounded up the stairs with a speed that belied his years. His sudden appearance in the main church created exactly the distraction needed. Shouts erupted as the hunters scrambled to avoid the snarling animal, their torches wavering as they tried to track his movement in the darkness. "It's just a damn dog. Where there's a dog, there's a master. Find him!" But Boone had vanished into the shadows between the pews, his intimate knowledge of the building's layout giving him every advantage. The hunters spread out in pursuit, leaving the cellar temporarily unguarded. Jed didn't waste the opportunity. He climbed swiftly and silently, pausing only to ensure the wooden crate remained hidden in the cellar's deepest corner. Samuel's greatest treasures would wait there until he could return with proper preparation and perhaps some advantage over the men who sought them. The church had become a maze of moving lights and shouting voices as the hunters tried to corner Boone. But the dog was too clever, too familiar with such games from years of wilderness survival. He led them on a chase that kept them occupied, while Jed slipped out through the rear entrance and melted back into the forest. Minutes later, Boone joined him at their predetermined rendezvous point, tongue lolling in what might have been satisfaction. The distraction had worked perfectly, buying them time and freedom at the cost of revealing their presence. But now the rules had changed completely. The hunters knew someone was actively working against them, someone with knowledge of Samuel's secrets and access to whatever treasures lay hidden. The careful stalking would end, replaced by aggressive pursuit that wouldn't stop until they claimed their prize or eliminated the competition. "Good boy," Jed whispered, scratching behind his companion's ears. "But things are about to get a whole lot more interesting." Behind them, angry voices echoed through the mountains as 3 frustrated men realized they'd been outmaneuvered by an old hermit and his faithful dog. The hunt was far from over, but its parameters had shifted dramatically. Samuel*s maps showed the way to Cañón de los Santos and whatever sanctuary waited there. But reaching it would require evading professional hunters across terrain that offered both opportunities and deadly hazards. The race for Samuel's legacy was about to begin, in earnest. The pursuit began at dawn. Jed heard them coming long before he saw them. The steady rhythm of hoofbeats on stone, the jingle of tack and weaponry, the occasional curse when a horse stumbled. On loose rock, they were following his trail with the persistence of bloodhounds, no longer content to wait and watch. From his vantage point on a granite outcrop 2 miles northwest of the church, Jed studied his pursuers through the small spyglass he'd carried for years. 3 riders, as expected, but now he could see details that the darkness had hidden. The leader sat his saddle with military bearing, his weathered face bearing scars that spoke of violence survived. The second man was younger, maybe 30, with the lean build of someone accustomed to hard travel. But it was the third rider who troubled Jed most, an older man whose careful movements and constant alertness suggested experience with manhunts. "Professional trackers," Jed murmured to Boone, who lay panting beside him in the scant shade of a twisted pine. "This ain't their first rodeo, old boy." The maps Samuel had left painted a clear route to Cañón de los Santos, but the journey would take them across 20 miles of increasingly difficult terrain. Open ground where horses held the advantage, narrow passages where a single man might hold off a dozen, and finally the approach to the canyon itself, a maze of slot canyons and dead ends that had claimed unwary travelers for centuries. But first, they had to reach it alive. Jed folded the spyglass and began the careful descent from his observation post. The hunters were perhaps an hour behind, following sign with the methodical patience that marked true professionals. They weren't rushing, weren't taking chances. They knew time was on their side as long as they didn't lose the trail. The first test came at Willow Creek, where the mountain stream had carved a deep channel between towering rock walls. Samuel's map showed an old mining trail that switched back down the eastern face, but it also warned of unstable footing and rock slides. On horseback, the descent would be treacherous. On foot, merely dangerous. Jed studied the crossing for several minutes, weighing options. The creek ran high with autumn snowmelt, its current strong enough to sweep away man or horse. But upstream, perhaps a quarter mile, Samuel had marked what looked like a ford, shallow water over a bed of solid stone. The detour would cost precious time, but might also cost his pursuers their advantage. Horses were liability in truly rough country, and experienced hunters would know when to abandon them. Force that choice early, and the odds began to even out. Boone whined softly as they began the climb toward the ford, his aging joints protesting the constant scramble over broken rock. The dog had been uncomplaining through their years of wandering, but this pursuit was pushing him beyond his limits. Jed's heart ached, watching his faithful companion struggle, but turning back meant certain capture and probable death. "Just a little farther, old friend," Jed promised, though he wasn't sure either of them would survive to see the promise kept. The ford proved exactly as Samuel had described. Knee-deep water running clear over granite slabs, worn smooth by millennia of flow. But crossing required careful timing, reading the current and finding secure footing with each step. Jed went first, testing each placement before committing his weight, then called Boone across when he'd reached the far bank, safely. The dog's crossing was less graceful but equally successful, and soon they were climbing the western slope toward higher ground. Behind them, the sound of pursuing horses had stopped, suggesting the hunters had reached the creek and were assessing their options. Jed allowed himself a brief rest on a ledge that offered both concealment and a view back down the valley. Through his spyglass, he watched the 3 men examining the trail where it disappeared at the creek's edge. The leader was gesturing upstream and downstream, clearly debating whether to follow the detour or attempt a direct crossing. After several minutes of discussion, they chose the ford route, a decision that bought Jed perhaps an hour's advantage, but it also confirmed his assessment of their competence. Less experienced hunters might have tried to force the direct crossing, losing time and possibly lives to the treacherous current. These men made careful choices, prioritizing success over speed. The trail to Cañón de los Santos led through increasingly wild country, following ridgelines that offered spectacular views but precious little cover. Samuel's notes warned of exposure to weather and observation, but also mentioned several places where pursuit might be discouraged or eliminated entirely. The first such opportunity came at Dead Horse Gap, where an ancient landslide had created a narrow passage between towering cliff faces. Samuel had marked it with warnings about unstable rock and deadfall traps, but also noted that providence favors the prepared defender. Jed studied the gap through his spyglass, understanding immediately what his brother had meant. The passage was barely wide enough for a single horse, with loose rock balanced precariously on both sides. A man who knew what he was doing could bring down enough stone to block the trail for days, maybe weeks. But using such tactics would transform pursuit into warfare, crossing lines that peaceful men hesitated to breach. Jed had never killed another human being, though he'd come close during his logging days when disputes over timber rights had turned violent. The thought of deliberately causing death, even in self-defense, sat heavy on his conscience. Yet Samuel's letter had been clear about the stakes. The artifacts they protected weren't merely valuable, they were sacred relics that evil men would corrupt for earthly power. How many lives might be saved if those artifacts remained hidden? How many souls preserved from temptation? What would you do, little brother? Jed asked the mountain wind. How far would you go to protect what you died for? The answer seemed to whisper back from Samuel's journal, remembered words that spoke of duty transcending personal comfort. Some trusts are worth any sacrifice, any cost to conscience or soul. But even as Jed prepared to set his trap, doubt gnawed at him. These men might be treasure hunters and killers, but they were still human beings, with families who would mourn their loss. Did protecting sacred artifacts justify taking lives, even in defense of something holy? The moral struggle was interrupted by Boone's warning growl. The dog had positioned himself at the gap's entrance, hackles raised as he stared back down the trail. Their pursuers were closer than expected. Perhaps only minutes behind. Decision time had arrived without resolution. Jed could trigger the rockfall and eliminate the threat permanently, or trust to speed and stealth for continued escape. Either choice carried risks, but only one carried the weight of blood on his hands. As hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, Jed made his choice. He began loosening keystones in the natural dam of loose rock, preparing a controlled slide that would block the passage without necessarily killing anyone caught within. A warning, rather than an execution, though the margin between the two was measured in seconds and luck. The first rider entered the gap just as Jed triggered the slide. Stones cascaded down with a roar that drowned out shouted warnings, filling the narrow passage with dust and debris. When the avalanche settled, Dead Horse Gap was sealed as effectively as if cement had been poured across its width. But from beyond the barrier came sounds that chilled Jed's blood. Groans of pain, a horse's agonized whinnying, voices raised in anger and desperation. His attempt at non-lethal deterrence had still caused harm, possibly death. The moral victory felt hollow when measured against real suffering. At least now we know what we're dealing with, came the leader's voice, muffled by rock but carrying clearly in the thin air. No more games, boys. This old man wants a war. He's got one. The response eliminated any lingering hope for peaceful resolution. Professional courtesy had been replaced by professional anger, the kind that didn't stop until accounts were settled in blood. Jed had bought time and safety at the cost of making enemies who would pursue him to the gates of hell itself. But he'd also learned something important about himself. When pressed to choose between abstract morality and concrete protection of what Samuel had died for, he'd chosen protection. The artifacts in that hidden cellar were worth fighting for, worth the risks he was taking and the costs he was paying. "Come on, old boy," he said to Boone, who was already moving toward the trail that led deeper into the mountains. Time to see what other surprises Samuel left for us. Behind them, the sound of tools on stone echoed through Dead Horse Gap as 3 angry men began the laborious process of clearing their way forward. The delay would be significant, but not permanent. Professional hunters carried professional equipment, and stone barriers were just another obstacle to overcome. But ahead lay Cañón de los Santos, and whatever sanctuary Samuel had prepared for the artifacts that had cost him his life. The final act of their 40-year drama was approaching, and Jed found himself looking forward to it with something that might have been anticipation. His brother's voice seemed to whisper encouragement from the mountain wind. Some fights are worth having, even when you're not sure you can win them. Cañón de los Santos opened before them like a wound in the earth, its red sandstone walls rising sheer for 300 feet on either side. The Slot Canyon's entrance was nearly hidden behind a screen of ancient cottonwoods, their golden leaves rustling in the autumn wind like whispered prayers. Samuel's map had been precise, but even with detailed directions, Jed might have missed the narrow opening if not for the carved symbol on a boulder near the entrance. The same geometric pattern that decorated the wooden cross. Boone collapsed in the shade of the cottonwoods, his sides heaving from the brutal climb through increasingly thin air. The dog had given everything he had to reach this place, driven by loyalty beyond his failing strength. Jed knelt beside his faithful companion, sharing water from his canteen and precious strips of jerky from his dwindling supplies. "You did. Good, old friend," Jed murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Samuel would be proud of both of us." The canyon's mouth was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways, but beyond the entrance it opened into a natural cathedral. Walls soared overhead, their surfaces carved by wind and water into flowing patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Petroglyphs covered the lower reaches, spirals and human figures, animals both familiar and strange, symbols that spoke of centuries of reverence. Samuel, quotes map, showed the way deeper into the canyon system, through passages that branched and twisted like a maze designed by divine hands. But it was the sound that drew Jed forward, a low humming that seemed to emerge from the rock itself, growing stronger as he penetrated the canyon's depths. The passage opened into a circular chamber perhaps 50 feet across, its domed ceiling pierced by a natural skylight that sent a shaft of golden afternoon light straight down to an altar of living stone. But it was what surrounded the altar that stopped Jed in his tracks. Bodies, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows as if sleeping peacefully in the cathedral's embrace. Some wore the rough clothing of miners and prospectors, others the more refined garments of townspeople and travelers. All appeared to have died recently, their flesh mummified by the canyon's dry air, but showing no signs of violence or disease. And standing beside the altar, very much alive, was a woman whose face Jed recognized from a faded daguerreotype he'd found among Samuel's possessions. "Hello, Jed," Catherine said, her voice carrying the refined accent that had enchanted 2 brothers 40 years earlier. "I've been waiting so very long for you to find us." She looked exactly as she had in the photograph, young, beautiful, untouched by the decades that had turned Jed's hair gray and lined his face with mountain weather. Her dress was the deep blue of evening sky, immaculate despite the canyon's dust, and her honey-colored hair fell in perfect waves around shoulders that should have borne the weight of 40 winters. "You're dead," Jed whispered, though the words felt foolish even as he spoke them. "Samuel wrote that both of you." "Samuel wrote many things in those final days," Catherine interrupted, stepping closer with movements that held unnatural grace. "Fear makes men careless with truth, but I never died, Jed. I simply found a better way to live." Behind her, other figures emerged from alcoves carved into the chamber walls. Men and women, all bearing faces Jed recognized from Samuel's journal, and maps, members of Los Custodios, who had supposedly vanished over the decades, presumed dead or scattered. Father Martinez moved with the same eerily preserved vitality as Catherine, his clerical robes unmarked by time or travel. Beside him walked J. Whitehorse, the frontiersman from the daguerreotype, and C. Valdez in his fine Mexican clothing. "Your artifacts," Father Martinez said, his voice carrying authority that seemed to resonate from the canyon walls themselves. "You've seen them, touched them. You know what they can do." Jed's hand went instinctively to the carved cross hidden in his shirt pocket. The wood felt warm against his palm, almost pulsing with its own heartbeat. Samuel died protecting them from men who would misuse their power. "Samuel died because he couldn't accept what we offered him," Catherine replied, sadness coloring her unchanged features. "The cup grants more than healing, more than inspiration. It grants life itself, eternal life for those who prove worthy to receive it." The implications struck Jed like a physical blow. These people had found a way to cheat death itself, preserving their youth and vitality through the power of artifacts they claimed were blessed by Christ himself. But the rows of bodies suggested a terrible cost. "The others?" Jed asked, gesturing toward the silent figures arranged around the chamber. "What happened to them?" "They sought the cup's blessing," Whitehorse answered, his voice carrying the flat tone of absolute certainty. "Some were found worthy, others were not. The divine light burns away impurity, but some souls carry too much darkness to survive the cleansing." Catherine moved closer, her unchanged beauty both compelling and terrifying in equal measure. "Samuel brought the artifacts here as we instructed, but when we offered him the cup's gift, he refused, said it was blasphemy, corruption of God's natural order. He tried to hide them from us, to keep them from fulfilling their true purpose, which is building the kingdom of heaven on earth," Father Martinez declared, spreading his arms to encompass the chamber and its silent congregation. "Creating a community of the blessed, the chosen ones who have proven worthy of eternal life. From this, a sanctuary, we will spread the true faith across the world, offering salvation to all who accept it." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Los Custodios hadn't been protecting the artifacts from corruption. They were the corruption Samuel had feared. They'd discovered that the cup could grant extended life, possibly even immortality, and had begun using it to build their own divine kingdom with themselves as immortal rulers. "The people outside," Jed said slowly, the treasure hunters following. "Me, they work for you." Catherine's smile confirmed his suspicions. "Briggs and his men have served us faithfully for decades. When you escaped from the church with Samuel's maps, we knew you'd come here eventually. Family bonds are so predictable, so wonderfully exploitable." "You killed my brother." "Samuel killed himself," Whitehorse corrected. "We offered him paradise and he chose martyrdom instead. His death was necessary to protect what we've built here, but it brought us no joy." Jed's hand tightened on the carved cross, feeling its warmth spread through his palm and up his arm. Whatever power resided in these artifacts, it recognized the difference between sacred purpose and selfish corruption. Samuel had died not just protecting treasure, but protecting the world from these immortal zealots who would remake humanity in their own image. "You want me to bring you the artifacts." "From the church," he said. "You want to survive the next few minutes?" Catherine replied, her beautiful face hardening into something that belonged on a Byzantine icon, remote, judgmental, inhuman. "The cup shows us truth, Jed. We know you carry the key to Samuel's hiding place, know you've read his journals and maps. You can lead us to the remaining artifacts, or you can join these others in their eternal rest." Around the chamber, the preserved members of Los Custodios began to move closer, their faces showing none of the compassion that should accompany true faith. They had drunk from the cup and gained life, but somewhere in the process they had lost their souls. "What makes you think I'd help you?" Father Martinez gestured toward the rows of bodies. "Because the alternative is death, and you're too practical a man to choose martyrdom over cooperation. Samuel was always the idealist. You were the survivor." But even as they spoke, Jed felt something changing in the chamber's atmosphere. The carved cross was growing warmer, its heat spreading through his body like liquid fire, and from somewhere beyond the chamber he could hear Boone barking, not the warning bark of danger, but the excited bark of greeting. Someone else had found. Cañón de los Santos. Catherine quote. S eyes widened as she felt the same atmospheric shift. Impossible. The canyon's entrance is hidden, protected by... Her words were cut off by the thunder of hoofbeats echoing through the stone passages, but these weren't the measured rhythms of 3 hunters following a trail. This was a cavalry. Charged boots and weapons and voices raised in coordinated assault. "Briggs!" Whitehorse called out, uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time. The answer came not in words, but in gunfire. The sharp crack of rifles echoing through the canyon system, followed by screams and curses and the sound of running feet. But these weren't the voices of 3 treasure hunters. This was an army. Jed began backing toward the chamber's entrance, his mind racing through possibilities. The sound of battle grew closer, suggesting whoever had arrived was fighting their way through the canyon's defenses. But who could have known about this place? Who had the resources to mount such an assault? The answer came in the form of a familiar voice echoing off the canyon walls, calling out in Spanish-accented English, "Los Custodios! Your crimes have found you at last. Surrender in the name of the true church." Father Martinez went pale despite his preserved youth. "Domingo," he whispered. "But we destroyed his order decades ago." "Apparently not as thoroughly as you thought," Catherine replied, her composure finally cracking. The immortal guardians of stolen artifacts suddenly found themselves facing mortal judgment, and their centuries of confidence began crumbling like the canyon walls under siege. The game had changed completely, and Jed found himself caught between 2 groups of fanatics, each claiming divine authority for their actions. But he still held Samuel's key, still carried the carved cross that seemed to pulse with its own holy fire. Whatever happened next, the true artifacts, the ones Samuel had died protecting, remained hidden where only family would think to look. The final battle for his brother's legacy was about to begin. The sound of battle drew closer with each passing moment. Rifle fire shouted commands in Spanish, and the distinctive crack of dynamite echoing through the canyon's stone corridors. Jed pressed himself against the chamber wall as Catherine and her immortal companions rushed to defensive positions they'd clearly prepared long ago. "How many?" Father Martinez demanded, producing a rifle from behind the altar with movements that spoke of military training. "At least 20, Whitehorse replied, peering through a gap in the chamber's entrance. "Maybe more. They're using explosives to clear the outer defenses." Catherine's face had transformed from ethereal beauty into something harder, more calculating. "Domingo always was thorough. We should have killed him when we had the chance." "Who is Domingo?" Jed asked, though part of him suspected the answer would only complicate an already impossible situation. "Father Domingo Vasquez," Catherine replied without taking her eyes off the passage entrance. "Former member of Los Custodios, until he developed inconvenient scruples about our methods. He's been hunting us for 30 years, trying to restore the true faith by destroying what he calls our corruption." The irony wasn't lost on Jed. Samuel had died trying to protect sacred artifacts from one group of fanatics, only to have those same artifacts fall into the hands of another group of fanatics, who were now under attack by a 3rd group of fanatics. Each side claimed divine authority. Each believed their cause justified any means necessary. But the carved cross in his pocket pulsed with increasing heat, its warmth spreading through his body like liquid courage. Whatever power resided in Samuel's artifacts, it seemed to recognize the approach of something significant. Whether salvation or damnation remained to be seen. "The back passages," Valdez said urgently. "We can retreat deeper into the canyon. System, wait them out in the sacred chambers." "No," Catherine's voice carried absolute authority. "This ends here. We've run from Domingo's crusade long enough. It's time to show him what happens when mortals challenge the divinely blessed. She moved to the chamber's center and knelt beside the stone altar, pressing her hands against symbols carved into its surface. The rock began to glow within a light, and the humming Jed had heard earlier intensified into something that resonated. In his bones dot around the chamber, the rows of bodies began to stir. Sweet Jesus, Jed breathed, as corpses that had lain motionless for decades began to rise from their resting places. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, but undeniably purposeful. Dead eyes fixed on the chamber's entrance with the focused intensity of soldiers awaiting orders. The cup's power extends beyond mere life, Father Martinez explained, with the casual tone of a teacher discussing basic theology. Death is simply another boundary to cross for those with sufficient faith. The resurrected dead moved to defensive positions with military precision, their decayed hands somehow managing to grip weapons that had been placed beside their bodies. Men who had died seeking immortality now served as immortal soldiers, bound to the will of those who had judged them unworthy of true life. But even as Catherine marshaled her unholy army, the sounds of approaching battle suggested her enemies came prepared for exactly this kind of supernatural warfare. The explosions had stopped, replaced by chanting in Latin that echoed off the canyon walls, like a counterpoint to the stone altar's humming. "Exorcism," Whitehorse muttered, his preserved face showing the first signs of genuine fear. "Domingos." Brought priests. Through the chamber's entrance, Jed could see lights approaching, not the harsh glare of electric torches, but the warm glow of blessed candles and burning incense. The chanting grew louder, recognizable now as prayers for the sanctification of corrupted ground and the laying to rest of souls held beyond their proper time. The effect on Catherine's resurrected army was immediate and devastating. The corpses closest to the entrance began to convulse, their borrowed animation failing as holy words washed over them like cleansing fire. One by one, they collapsed back into true death, their temporary resurrection ended by prayers that carried the weight of genuine faith. "Impossible," Catherine snarled, pressing harder against the altar's symbols. "The cup's power is absolute. Nothing can overcome." Her words were cut off as a new figure appeared in the chamber's entrance, an elderly priest whose weathered face bore the scars of decades spent fighting battles most men never imagined. Father Domingo Vasquez moved. With the steady confidence of absolute faith, his voice never faltering in its recitation of prayers that seemed to shake the canyon walls themselves. Behind him came others, younger priests, lay brothers, and what appeared to be Mexican soldiers wearing the insignia of some special unit. All carried weapons, but their primary armament was clearly spiritual rather than martial. "Catherine Mills," Domingo called out in accented English, his voice cutting through the chamber's supernatural atmosphere like a blade. "Your time of hiding has ended. Surrender the artifacts you have corrupted, and perhaps God will show mercy for your souls." "Mercy," Catherine laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the chamber's acoustics. "We are beyond such petty concerns. We have transcended mortality itself, become more than human, more than... You have become abominations," Domingo interrupted, stepping fully into the chamber, despite the continuing efforts of Catherine's remaining defenders. "Thieves who stole holy relics and perverted their purpose for earthly gain. The cup of Christ was never meant to grant immortality to the unworthy." The theological argument might have continued, but Jed had more immediate concerns. Caught between two groups of armed fanatics, his survival depended on finding a third option that didn't exist on their battlefield. The carved cross in his pocket had grown almost too hot to bear, its energy building towards some kind of climax. And that's when he noticed something the others had missed in their focus on each other. The stone altar wasn't just glowing, it was cracking. Whatever power Catherine was drawing from it was exceeding its capacity to contain or channel safely. Hairline fractures spread across its surface like a spider web of light, and the humming had taken on an unstable quality that spoke of imminent collapse. Samuel's journal had mentioned the danger of corrupting sacred vessels, the way holy power could turn destructive when channeled through unworthy hands. Catherine and her immortal companions had been using the cup's power for decades, perhaps centuries, without understanding the toll such abuse would take on both the artifacts and the places where they were stored. The canyon itself was becoming unstable. Jed began backing toward a side passage he'd noticed earlier, keeping his movements small and casual to avoid drawing attention. Boone appeared at his side as if summoned, the faithful dog somehow having found his way into the chamber despite the chaos outside. Together, they edged toward what might be their only escape route. But even as he moved, Jed found himself torn by conflicting loyalties. The artifacts hidden in the church cellar represented his brother's legacy, the trust Samuel had died to preserve. Abandoning them to either faction felt like betraying that sacrifice, like letting his brother's death become meaningless. Yet staying meant certain death in a battle between forces he couldn't hope to overcome. Father Domingo's crusaders were advancing steadily, their prayers disrupting Catherine's supernatural defenses, but Catherine and her immortal companions had decades of experience using powers that mortals could barely comprehend. The carved cross pulsed again, its heat now almost unbearable. But with the heat came understanding. Samuel hadn't hidden the most important artifact in the church cellar with the others. The cross itself was the key, not just to locked containers, but to something far more significant. Trust in Boone's nose. Samuel had written in his final message, "He knows more than he appears." Jed looked down at his faithful companion, seeing for the first time the intelligence that had guided them through decades of wilderness wandering. Boone wasn't just a dog, he was a guardian, placed in Jed's path years ago for exactly this moment. "You know, don't you, old boy?" Jed whispered. "You know where Samuel really hid the most important thing." Boone's tail wagged once, and his eyes fixed on a section of the chamber wall that looked identical to every other section. But when Jed pressed the carved cross against that particular spot, the stone began to glow with the same inner light that emanated from the cracking altar. A hidden door opened in the canyon wall, revealing a passage that led deeper into the mountain's heart. And from that passage came a light that made all other sources seem dim by comparison. The radiance of something so pure, so sacred, that both factions stopped their battle to stare in wonder. Samuel "'S greatest secret wasn't the artifacts he'd died protecting. It was this, a sanctuary prepared not for earthly treasures, but for the divine presence itself, a place where God's grace could dwell without corruption or perversion. The real choice wasn't between competing groups of fanatics. It was between the earthly power they all sought and the heavenly grace that Samuel had spent his life trying to preserve. As battle resumed around him with renewed fury, Jed faced the decision that would define not just his own fate, but the legacy of faith itself in these sacred mountains. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The hidden sanctuary beyond the stone door defied every expectation. Where Jed had braced himself for another carved chamber or ancient cave, he found instead a space that seemed to exist outside the normal laws of physics. The walls curved impossibly upward, disappearing into a soft luminescence that had no visible source. The air itself seemed to sing with harmonies that touched something deeper than hearing. And at the center of this impossible space sat a simple wooden table, rough-hewn from mountain pine, bearing upon it a single clay cup. Not gold, not jewels, not the ornate chalice he'd seen in the church cellar. This vessel looked like something a carpenter might have used for his daily water, worn smooth by countless hands, but unremarkable in every way, except for the light that seemed to emanate from its very substance. "The true cup," Jed whispered, understanding flooding through him like warm honey. Samuel Quotes' journal had spoken of decoys and misdirection, of protecting the sacred through layers of deception. The golden chalice and its companions were valuable, certainly, likely artifacts of great historical significance. But they weren't the cup that had touched Christ's lips at the Last Supper. That humble vessel had been hidden here, in a sanctuary that existed between earth and heaven, waiting for someone worthy to find it. Boone padded forward and settled beside the table with a contented sigh, as if he'd been carrying the weight of guardianship for years and could finally rest. The old dog's eyes held a peace Jed had never seen before, the look of a faithful servant whose duty was nearly complete. Behind them, the sounds of battle raged on, rifle fire, chanted prayers, and the inhuman screams of the undead being laid to permanent rest. But in this sanctuary, such violence seemed distant and unimportant, like thunder from a storm passing far overhead. Jed approached the table with reverence born of sudden understanding. This was what Samuel had truly died protecting. Not earthly treasures that could be stolen or corrupted, but the presence of the divine itself made manifest in the simplest of forms. The cup radiated warmth and peace that spoke directly to the soul, offering healing that went far beyond the physical. But even as he reached toward it, a voice from the sanctuary's entrance stopped him cold. "I wouldn't, if I were you." Catherine stood in the doorway, her ethereal beauty now marred by cuts and dust from the battle outside. Behind her, Father Martinez supported Valdez, whose preserved form showed wounds that leaked something darker than blood. They were the last survivors of Los Custodios, driven from their stronghold by Domingo's relentless assault. 40 years we searched for this place, Catherine continued, moving into the sanctuary with careful steps. 40 years following clues Samuel left in his journal, tracking every reference to the true sanctuary. And here it is, protected by nothing more than a wooden door and an old dog. Samuel protected it with faith, Jed replied, not moving. From his position beside the table, "Something you wouldn't understand," Catherine laughed, the sound harsh in the sanctuary's perfect acoustics. "Faith? Is that what you call it when a man abandons his wife to die alone in the wilderness? When he chooses a piece of pottery over the woman he claimed to love? He chose what was right over what was easy. That's what faith means." "Pretty words," Father Martinez interjected, raising the rifle he still carried despite their sacred surroundings. "But faith doesn't stop bullets, and righteousness doesn't heal the wounds of time. We've spent decades building something eternal, something that transcends mortal limitations. That cup represents power beyond imagination, power to remake the world according to God's true will." "God's will?" Jed shook his head. "You've been drinking from a golden cup for 40 years. Calling yourselves immortal, raising the dead to serve your ambitions. Does any of that sound like God's will to you?" "The cup grants life to the worthy," Valdez gasped, his wounds clearly more serious than they'd initially appeared. "We have been judged and found acceptable. Our immortality proves our righteousness." But even as he spoke, cracks began appearing in his preserved flesh, hairline fractures that spread like the ones that had appeared in the stone altar. Whatever power had sustained Los Custodios through the decades was failing, their borrowed immortality finally reaching its limits. "You drank from a fake?" Jed realized, his voice filled with wonder and pity. "All these years, all those people. You killed trying to find the true cup. You were already drinking from a copy." Catherine's face went ashen as understanding struck her. "Impossible. The power was real, the life extension, the resurrection abilities, real but temporary." Samuel made sure of that. Jed looked down at the simple clay vessel on the wooden table. "He knew you'd find the golden chalice eventually, knew you'd assume it was the genuine article, so he let you have your counterfeit immortality while the true cup waited here for someone who would use it properly." The implications crashed over. The three immortals, like a physical wave. Decades of life they'd believed eternal were suddenly revealed as borrowed time coming due. The power they'd wielded, the authority they'd claimed, the countless lives they'd taken, all based on a deception that was now collapsing around them. Valdez was the first to succumb, his wounds overwhelmed by the failure of whatever force had sustained him. He collapsed to the sanctuary floor, his body finally accepting the death it had been denied for so long. Father Martinez followed moments later, his preserved features aging 40 years in as many seconds before he crumbled to dust. Catherine fought the dissolution longer, her will stronger or her corruption deeper. But even she couldn't deny the inevitable. As her borrowed youth faded, revealing the withered crone she'd been hiding beneath supernatural glamour, her voice cracked with desperation. "The cup," she gasped, reaching toward the clay vessel with hands that were now gnarled with age. "I can still, if I drink from the true source." But her fingers passed through the cup as if it were made of light, unable to grasp what she'd sought for so long. The sanctuary itself seemed to reject her presence, its harmonious singing becoming discordant whenever she moved closer to the table. "It doesn't work that way," Jed said gently, understanding flooding through him as he watched her futile struggles. "The cup doesn't grant immortality to those who seek it for themselves. It offers healing to those who would use that healing in service to others." Catherine's ancient eyes blazed with fury, even as her body continued its rapid decay. "You sanctimonious fool! You don't understand what you're rejecting. Power over death itself, the ability to reshape the world according to divine will." "I understand perfectly," Jed interrupted. "That's why I won't touch it." The statement hung in the sanctuary's rarefied air like a prayer. Catherine stared at him in disbelief, unable to comprehend someone who would turn away from ultimate power when it lay within reach. But Jed had finally learned the lesson Samuel had tried to teach him 40 years too late. Some gifts were too precious to claim, too sacred to possess. The cup offered not ownership but stewardship, not power but responsibility. Those who reached for it with grasping hands would find only emptiness, while those who approached with open hearts might find more than they ever imagined. From outside the sanctuary came the sound of approaching footsteps. Father Domingo and his forces had finally broken through Los Custodios' defenses and located the hidden door. Soon they would arrive to claim their own prize, to add the true cup to their collection of recovered relics. But they would find only what they were worthy to receive, just as every seeker before them had discovered. The cup would judge them, as it had judged all who sought its power, offering exactly what their hearts truly desired, rather than what their lips claimed to want. Jed stepped back from the table, his decision made. Whatever happened next, he would not be the one to determine the fate of something so sacred. That choice belonged to powers far greater than any mortal ambition. Catherine, S final scream of rage echoed through the sanctuary as her borrowed centuries finally claimed their due, reducing her to dust that scattered on winds that touched no earthly atmosphere. The last of Los Custodios had fallen, but their final lesson lingered in the air like incense. Some treasures were too dangerous to possess, too holy to claim, too perfect to corrupt with human desire. Father Domingo entered the sanctuary like a man walking into a cathedral, his weathered features softened by wonder as he took in the impossible space and the simple table at its center. Behind him came two younger priests and a Mexican army captain, all moving with the reverent silence of pilgrims approaching a shrine. "Dios mío," Domingo whispered, crossing himself as his eyes fell upon the clay cup. After 30 years of hunting these corrupted artifacts, to find the true vessel at last. Jed watched the priest's face carefully, reading the mixture of awe and hunger that played across his features. This was a different kind of desire than Catherine's naked ambition, but desire nonetheless. The yearning of a faithful servant who believed he could be trusted with ultimate power. "You know what it is?" Jed asked. "The cup of the Last Supper," Domingo replied, his voice hushed with reverence. "The vessel from which our Lord instituted the Eucharist, blessed by his own lips and sanctified by his blood. It has been lost to the faithful for centuries, hidden by those who feared its power would be misused. The priest stepped closer to the table, his hands clasped behind his back, as if preventing himself from reaching out prematurely. Los Custodios stole it from the cathedral at Toledo in 1378, claiming they could better protect it from Moorish conquest. Instead, they perverted its purpose, used its power for earthly gain and personal immortality. "And you'll do better?" Jed's question carried no accusation, only genuine curiosity. Domingo. Quote's eyes flashed with the certainty of absolute faith. "The Church is the bride of Christ, appointed by divine will to guard his sacred treasures. In proper hands, guided by centuries of theological wisdom, the cup could heal the sick, convert the faithless, restore the faithful to perfect communion with God." "Sounds familiar," Jed observed. "Different words, same hunger." The priest's face hardened at the implied criticism. "I have dedicated my life to recovering artifacts stolen by heretics and blasphemers. Everything I've done has been in service to the greater glory of God and His Church, including the people you killed getting here. The corrupt forfeit their right to life when they steal from the Almighty," Captain Morales interjected, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Los Custodios murdered hundreds over the decades, using sacred power to build their own twisted kingdom. Justice demanded their destruction." Jed looked around the sanctuary, noting how the walls seemed to pulse with gentle light whenever strong. Emotion filled the space. The cup itself sat unchanged on its simple table, neither encouraging nor forbidding their conversation, but somehow present in a way that suggested awareness beyond mere objects. "What happens now?" he asked. Domingo moved another step closer to the table. "Now we return the cup to its rightful home, where it can be properly venerated and its power channeled through appropriate ritual. The Vatican has prepared a special sanctuary, protected by the finest security and staffed by priests trained specifically for this responsibility." "A museum, a shrine," Domingo corrected firmly. "A place where the faithful can come to experience the presence of the divine, where the cup's power can be studied and understood by theologians who've spent their lives preparing for such responsibility." But, even as he spoke, the priest's eyes never left the vessel, and his hands had begun to tremble with suppressed longing. The hunger was there, carefully disguised behind layers of theological justification, but unmistakable to someone who'd watched other seekers reveal their true desires. "You want a drink from it?" Jed said quietly. Domingo, quote,'s composure cracked slightly. "I want to understand it, to experience what our Lord experienced when he blessed the wine and offered it to his disciples. Is that not natural for one who has dedicated his life to following Christ's example?" Samuel wanted to understand it too. Look how that turned out. Samuel was a Protestant, one of the younger priests interjected with barely concealed disdain. He lacked the theological foundation necessary to properly approach such sacred mysteries. The Catholic Church has 2,000 years of experience with relics and their proper veneration. Jed thought of the golden chalice still hidden in the church cellar, of the bodies scattered around Cañón de los Santos, of Samuel's journal entries describing his growing fear of the power he'd sworn to protect. Experience with sacred objects seemed to correlate strongly with corruption and death, regardless of denominational affiliation. But before he could voice this observation, Boone rose from his resting place beside the table and padded over to Father Domingo. The old dog looked up at the priest with those intelligent eyes, tail wagging slowly, as if greeting an old friend. "He likes you," Jed observed, surprised by his companion's reaction. Domingo knelt and scratched behind Boone's ears. With gentle hands, animals often sense truth more clearly than humans do. They're not clouded by ambition or self-deception. As if responding to this praise, Boone moved back to the table and placed his front paws on its edge, looking directly at the clay cup. His tail wagged more vigorously, and he made a soft whining sound that seemed almost like encouragement. "He's trying to tell us something," Captain Morales said, his soldier's pragmatism cutting through the theological debate. Jed approached the table again, studying both the cup and his faithful companion's behavior. Boone had been guiding him throughout this entire journey, leading him to discoveries that revealed Samuel's true plan. Now the dog seemed to be offering one final piece of guidance. Samuel wrote that I should trust your nose, Jed told Boone, that you knew more than you appeared. What are you trying to show me? The answer came not from the dog, but from the cup itself. As Jed leaned closer, he could see that the simple clay vessel wasn't quite as plain as it had first appeared. Inscribed, around its rim in letters so small they were nearly invisible, were words in multiple languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and others he didn't recognize. The Great Commission, Domingo breathed, reading over Jed's shoulder. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. But there were other inscriptions as well, flowing seamlessly from one language to another, as if all human words were merely different expressions of a single divine truth. Jed couldn't read most of them, but somehow their meaning penetrated directly to his heart. Love one another, as I have loved you. Whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The words weren't just inscribed on the cup's surface. They seemed to emerge from within the clay itself, written not by human hands, but by the divine presence that had blessed this humble vessel with purpose beyond its simple form. And suddenly, Jed understood what Samuel had been trying to teach him, what Boone had been leading him to discover, what the sanctuary itself had been waiting to reveal. The cup wasn't meant to be possessed by anyone. Not by corrupt immortals seeking power, not by well-meaning priests wanting to study divine mysteries, not even by faithful servants hoping to do good with ultimate authority. It was meant to be shared. Samuel figured it out, Jed said wonderingly. That's why he created the sanctuary, why he left all those clues. The cup doesn't belong to any one person or group or church. It belongs to everyone who approaches it with genuine need and humble heart. Domingo's face showed his struggle between theological training and dawning understanding. But the security risks, the potential for abuse, are the same whether it's locked in a Vatican vault or hidden in a mountain cave, Jed interrupted. The cup protects itself. It gives each person exactly what they're worthy to receive, nothing more and nothing less. He looked around at the assembled group. Catholic priests seeking to recover lost relics, Mexican soldiers following orders, an old mountain man trying to honor his brother's memory, and a faithful dog who somehow understood truths that escaped. Human comprehension. The question isn't who deserves to control it, Jed continued. The question is whether we're brave enough to let it remain free. In the sanctuary's perfect silence, that question hung like incense in the air, waiting for an answer that would determine not just their immediate fate, but the future of faith itself. The silence that followed Jed's words stretched like the moment, between lightning and thunder, pregnant with possibility and consequence. Father Domingo stood frozen beside the table, his weathered hands hovering inches from the cup, while his face showed the internal war between lifelong conviction and sudden revelation. You ask me to abandon 30 years of sacred duty, the priest said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, to leave the holiest relic of our faith unguarded in a mountain cave where anyone might stumble upon it. Not anyone, Jed replied gently. Only those it calls to itself, only those who need what it offers and can accept what it demands in return. Captain Morales shifted uncomfortably, his soldiers training at odds with the mystical discussion surrounding him. Father, our orders were to secure the artifact and return it to church authority. The Vatican is expecting me to do what's right, Domingo interrupted, his eyes never leaving the simple clay vessel. The question is whether what's right matches what's expected. From somewhere in the sanctuaries, impossible depths came a sound like distant bells. Not the bronze tolling that had awakened Jed in the church, but something softer, more musical. The walls pulsed with gentle light that seemed to encourage rather than judge, offering support for whatever decision emerged from faithful hearts. Boone moved closer to Father Domingo and sat beside him, the old dog's presence somehow offering comfort to a man wrestling with the weight of theological centuries. The priest's hand found Boone's head, and for a moment his face showed the simple peace that comes from touching something uncomplicated by human ambition. "Samuel left me a letter," Jed said, pulling the final piece of correspondence from his brother's journal, written the night before he died, addressed to whoever found this place. "Would you like to hear what he said?" Domingo nodded, and Jed unfolded the yellowed paper with trembling hands. "To the faithful soul who finds this sanctuary, I pray you have come not as conqueror, but as pilgrim, not to claim, but to understand. The cup you see before you has waited through centuries of darkness for hearts ready to receive its true gift. I thought, when Los Custodios first showed me this vessel, that my duty was to guard it from those who would misuse its power. But power was never the point. The cup's true miracle is not what it gives to those who drink from it, but what it teaches about the nature of giving itself. Christ did not hoard the wine he blessed at that final supper. He shared it freely with all who gathered at his table, knowing that among them sat both faithful friends and those who would betray him. He understood that grace cannot be protected by withholding it, only by offering it without reservation or condition. The cup has taught me this truth through 40 years of wrestling with my own inadequacy. It belongs not to the worthy, for none of us are truly worthy, but to the needy. Not to the pure, for purity cannot be achieved through possession, but to the broken who seek healing. If you have found this place through violence and greed, the cup will teach you the cost of such desires. If you have come through faith and humility, it will show you wonders beyond imagination. But regardless of your motivation, it will offer you exactly what your heart most needs to become what God intends. The choice before you is simple. Will you trust in divine grace, or will you trust in human control? Will you let the cup remain free to work its miracles, or will you bind it to earthly authority that will inevitably corrupt its purpose? I have chosen to trust in grace, though it cost me my life. May you choose more wisely, and may whatever choice you make bring glory to the one who blessed this humble vessel with purpose beyond our understanding. The letter was signed not just with Samuel's name, but with a symbol Jed recognized from their childhood. Their mother's mark for baked goods, pressed into cookies and pies as a sign of love made tangible. Father Domingo was weeping quietly, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as the letter's implications settled into his soul. 30 years, he whispered. 30 years I've hunted these artifacts, believing that recovering them would somehow restore the Church's lost authority. But we lost that authority the moment we began treating grace as property to be hoarded rather than gift to be shared. He stepped back from the table, his decision crystallizing with each word. The cup stays here, not because it's safer, not because we lack the means to move it, but because this is where it belongs. Free, accessible, waiting for whoever needs what. It offers... Captain Morales looked incredulous. "Father, the Vatican will demand explanations. They've invested considerable resources in this operation." "Then I'll explain that some treasures are too precious to possess," Domingo replied with quiet certainty. "That our Lord's final gift to humanity was never meant to be locked away in vaults or displayed behind glass. It was meant to transform lives through direct encounter with divine love." The priest turned to Jed with eyes that held new understanding. "Your brother was wiser than any of us realized. He found a way to protect the sacred by refusing to control it, to preserve its power by allowing that power to remain free." Jed felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he'd carried for 4 decades, the burden of unfinished reconciliation, of words unsaid and love unexpressed. Samuel's true legacy wasn't the artifacts he'd died protecting, but the wisdom he'd gained. About the nature of protection itself. "What happens now?" he asked. Domingo smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Now we let the world know that Cañón de los Santos exists, that pilgrims are welcome to seek what they need from the cup that waits here. Some will come seeking miracles, others hoping to exploit its power. All will receive what their hearts are ready to accept. And Los Custodios, the golden chalice in the church? Let scholars debate their historical significance. Let museums display them as artifacts of human craftsmanship and spiritual longing. They've already served their purpose by leading us to this greater truth." The sanctuary's singing had grown stronger during their conversation, harmonies building into something that spoke of celebration and completion. The cup itself seemed to pulse with gentle approval, its simple clay form somehow conveying satisfaction at a choice made in faith rather than fear. As they prepared to leave the sanctuary, Jed took one last look at the vessel that had cost his brother's life and taught him the true meaning of brotherhood. Samuel had been right about so many things, about duty transcending personal desires, about love requiring sacrifice, about grace being too precious to hoard. But most of all, he'd been right about forgiveness. The cup offered healing, not just for bodies, but for relationships. Not just for individuals, but for the broken connections between souls who'd lost their way in pride and misunderstanding. Outside the sanctuary, autumn's sunlight slanted through the canyon walls, painting the red stone with gold that reminded Jed of better days ahead. Boone trotted beside him with renewed energy, the old dog's purpose fulfilled, but his companionship eternal. From the canyon's entrance came the sound of voices, not the harsh commands of soldiers or the chanted prayers of fanatics, but the gentle conversations of travelers sharing stories around a fire. Word was already spreading, as word of sacred places always did, drawing pilgrims and seekers to discover what waited in the sanctuary beyond the stone door. Some would find healing. Others would find judgment. All would encounter the cup's fundamental lesson that the divine presence couldn't be possessed, only experienced, couldn't be controlled, only trusted, couldn't be hoarded, only shared. As Jed began the long walk back to whatever life awaited him in the world beyond these sacred mountains, he carried with him the peace that comes from understanding that some duties, once fulfilled, transform into blessings that last beyond any earthly measure of time. Samuel, S. voice seemed to whisper on the canyon wind, "Well done, brother, well done." The bells of Cañón de los Santos began to ring, not with bronze and iron, but with the music of grace made manifest in clay and stone, and the humble faith of those who chose to trust in love greater than human ambition. The cup waited, patient and eternal, for whoever would come next, seeking what only the divine could provide. Some treasures were indeed too precious to possess, too sacred to control, too perfect to improve upon. And in that truth, two brothers found their way back to each other across the span of 40 years and the gulf of death itself, their reconciliation complete in the presence of grace that knew no boundaries and love that conquered even the grave.